Welcome back to TTRPG Talks, the show where we sit down and discuss with the creators the games we love. Today's guest is the true legendary Sandy Petersen, responsible for the great Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game, as well as creator writes and works on games like Doom, Quake, Age of Empires, and most recently, Petersen Games. Sandy, welcome.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
I always start with a question about how our guests got into TTRPGs to begin with.
Okay. Well, I was 19 years old. Wait. Yes, 19 years old. And I played the tabletop war games, mostly Avalon Hill, with my friends. And one of my friends came and said his professor had this new game called Dungeons and Dragons, and he described it, and it sounded really terrible. And I didn't want to try it. And then he said, "Well, let's have a look at it." So he brought it by, and I said, "Oh, you make because how was a dungeon fun to be in? I don't want to be in a dungeon." And he said, "No, it's not really a dungeon. It's like an underground maze with stuff, and you have these puzzles." And reading the text of the book, this is the first edition, you understand. It sounded kind of interesting, and so we said, "Let's give it a try." And after a couple months, we managed to scrape up enough money to buy our own copy of D&D. It was $10. That was a lot of money for us in college in 1974. And we returned the old copy to our professor, and then that was it. I started with the very first edition of D&D. There was no role-playing before it, and afterwards there was. Though, interestingly, in talking to the guys that started D&D, like Dave Arneson of those guys, apparently originally it came from playing Napoleonics, where they had one of the officers be their avatar, and over time he'd go up in rank. And
Right.
I find this really interesting is because we used Airfix figures to make to play a miniatures game we designed in high school and junior high, and my buddy and I had one of the characters be us, and we would advance in rank in the miniatures games. I'm not saying we would invent a D&D on our own, but clearly it was we were walking down the first steps of that path, And in D&D we got him out. Oh, there it is, and jump right in.
Was there an early? Where do you know you started to fall in love with the idea of role playing? Like, do you remember what caught your eye first, or what really clicked that first moment it clicked where it was amazing?
That you're playing you're playing the leader of a group. We back in the day, you have to understand that your charisma gave you a number of minions, and so our characters always were our character plus a bunch of minions. So it wasn't just us. I think if you had a charisma of 13 or at some level, you got one minion, then two. It could be a 17, you got 6. At 18, you got 12. So that was like a huge army. And we would keep track of their experience points too. That's not where we go. Anyway, we're reading this and we're getting the idea that we're going to a dungeon, we're facing monsters, there's tricks and traps and puzzles, and really the example of play that Gary Gygax wrote in there kind of set it off for us. So showing people going through and fighting monsters and killing giant spiders. And this sounded like really interesting. The idea of making a map like this and imposing it on my players. I mean, we'd all read fantasy, we'd all read science fiction. We understood the drill here, and being those characters and having magic spells and mighty armor and stuff just was super appealing. Before we'd ever even played it, it sounded like it would be interesting once I looked at the book. And then my buddy made his dungeon, and we went. He was the first guy. He was the first dungeon master in our group. So we went through his dungeon, figured things out, and then later on, we all started making dungeons, going into each other's dungeons. And over time, I did more and more. Then other role-playing games started to appear on the horizon. There was, we'd see these other games and look at them, and part of the thing was D&D's rules were so terrible that we mostly had to make them up. Like it didn't really explain how the magic worked. Every group I knew that played D&D used different rules for the magic. Our group, it turns out, actually used the rules that Gygax intended, but it was pure chance that we did that because, it wasn't obvious from the text. And then it didn't give you a combat system. It said use chainmail for the combat system. We got chainmail. And of course, there's no combat system in chainmail that you can use for hand-to-hand combat. So that was crazy. So we had to work out. So we invented our own combat system. So we're really designing our own game using the idea of D&D as a springboard, which was fantastic. And over time, as other games came out, then it took over. It took up a lot of our spare time. We played a lot less war games and a lot more role-playing games. What we would do is we would play D&D. Well, first it was just D&D. That's all we had. And then it became about 50% D&D and 50% whatever the game currently that we were interested in was playing. Chivalry or Sorcery or the Fantasy Trip or whatever it was. We play that other game, then go back to D&D, then play D&D plus this other game, then go back to D&D. Then in 1978, I came across the game RuneQuest, and we started the same way, about half D&D, about half RuneQuest. But then by the end of the year, we was all RuneQuest. It completely displaced D&D in our eyes.
I was about to ask about how far in were you when you first kind of encountered RuneQuest? Because that would have been
D&D or RuneQuest came out in 1978, and that's when I encountered it. We were active looking for games to play. And RuneQuest was it solved some of the things that bugged us about D&D. Like levels always seemed awkward. Experience points didn't seem based in reality. It really bugged me that you got better simply by getting money. It didn't make any sense. Rich guys in stories aren't the strongest, best guys. And we didn't like that. Here's just one example. Okay. We used to read Conan books, right? Mm-hmm. It's a Conan story where Conan's robbing this guy's house, and a guard catches him with and the guy has a crossbow, and Conan isn't wearing any armor because he's sneaking around. He's a burglar, basically. And Conan surrenders to the guard. And it's really obvious the guard is like not a high-level character. He's terrified of Conan, but he's got the crossbow on him, and Conan doesn't attack him because he's afraid he'll get shot by the crossbow. And we see that, and like, that would never happen in D&D. You would, like, one crossbow isn't going to kill you. You would just ignore it, especially a low-level guy, And so when RuneQuest came out, you could be afraid of a crossbow legitimately. You could also, another thing we liked about it was that you could have the equivalent of a first-level guy hang out with a high-level guy, and yet they both contribute to the fight. Whereas in D&D, if you have a first-level guy going along with a 9th or a 10th, all he does is get killed in the first 2 seconds. So he doesn't contribute. The high-level guy's better. Anyway, so those are the things we liked about it. And from there, I liked it so much, I got in contact with Greg Stafford, the owner of Chaosium. And from there, I did Call of Cthulhu, and, then my games were actually getting published instead of just, for me and my friends.
Yeah, I was going to ask kind of what was that process like of going from playing to realizing that you had this idea that you wanted to create?
Well, I had always been designing, right, as well as playing, because in fact, the very first advanced game I ever got was a copy of, I was 8 years old. My dad had a copy of the game Gettysburg from Avalon Hill, but really early on, we lost the rules. So all I had was the map and the counters, and it was really interesting, but I couldn't figure out how to play the game. So I put a lot of my effort trying to figure out how to play it. And then a couple of years later, we actually got another copy of it, and then I could see how to play it. But that started us off not only playing games, but designing games, modified rules. We'd get a game about World War I on the Western Front, and then we put together a game for World War I on the Eastern Front. So we had that too. We had our miniatures game with the Airfix figures. We had to make up our own rules for combat and magic for the D&D because we couldn't figure out the rules as they were written. So designing was just part of playing games. I want to play a game of space combat with dinosaurs. Because I had toy dinosaurs, and then we made the rules for it. We didn't rely on someone publishing them. So it was just natural for me to do that. And I don't know if that's common with every other group of gamers, but it was how I looked at it. So yeah, designing was just part of playing games because the games didn't completely satisfy what I needed.
For sure. And where were you? What brought about the inspiration for Call of Cthulhu?
Well, I'd loved Lovecraft for years, and no one had ever heard of Lovecraft that I knew. Every single person I knew who had heard about Lovecraft, had heard about them because I had told them. Okay. And Lovecraft was out of print. He was vanishingly hard to find. But he got reprinted when I was 17. I spent a vacation in New York with my dad. I found out they had the Ballantine Lovecrafts at a bookstore. So I said, Dad, I got to get these. So then instead of enjoying New York, I stayed in the hotel room reading these books, right? But what happened is that because I had been in contact with Greg Stafford, a friend of mine who knew Greg was encouraging me to do this. So I suggested to Greg that we do a Lovecraft variant of RuneQuest set in Lovecraft's Dreamlands, which is kind of a fantasy D&D-ish world. And he said instead that he was doing a game they were calling it Dark Worlds, which was Lovecraft in modern times. And that, so they weren't going to do it for RuneQuest, and I was like super interested in that. And I said, well, can I read the rules? Can I make suggestions? Can I test it? I just really want to know about it. And then his next communication was, well, why don't you just do it? And I was, because the guy we're working on, we don't really like what he's done, and we'll hand you the game. I said, okay, can you give me what he's done? And they said yes, and they never did. So I had to do it all from scratch. I wrote it over about a year on a typewriter. We didn't have word processors, right? So it was a typewriter. And
it's interesting that you mentioned sort of the Dreamlands, because I've just recently started to get exposed to RuneQuest, and I'm actually getting to play my first game today, later today.
Oh,
yeah, John Wick's agreeing to run us in a little short campaign, so I'm signed up to do that. That starts later this afternoon. I'm looking forward to it. But having recently just started to look into Glorantha, my first thought was, this reminds me a little more of that non-traditional fantasy that I'd see in the Dream Cycle or read in the Dream Cycle.
Yes, that's why I thought it would fit.
Yeah.
The rules of RuneQuest don't need to be in Glorantha, obviously. They're not tied to a system.
Right.
But Glorantha was also an interesting world. And the Greenlands would be an interesting world. And really, when I did Call of Cthulhu, what had happened is I'd already done a role-playing game just me and my friends, which we called American Gothic, which was a horror game set in modern times. And so they said, do Call of Cthulhu. And I said, great. But they said, you also have to use the basic role-playing system, which is the underlying, the system that RuneQuest is, the skill-based system. So I did, and it actually worked really well. But I'd already partly designed a game, and then I used BRP and did Call of Cthulhu. And the interesting thing about that is, I think it's interesting at least. So Chaosium, in common with everyone else, had never read Lovecraft. They just got the license. Okay. And in common with most everyone else, they thought Lovecraft was a terrible hack. No one, because Lovecraft is one of those authors that apparently you don't have to read to have an opinion about. Okay. So they just assumed he was a hack because that's what the critics said. But they got me to do it because they said, Sandy really likes Lovecraft, so he'll do a great job. And if we do it, we'll be all snarky and negative about it. And they knew they would do that, Like, for example, when they got, I think it was Shoemaker to do Batman 3, and he did a terrible job with like the bat nipples and the bat credit card, it's because in his heart of hearts, he doesn't believe anyone can genuinely like Batman. So he did this schlock job. Same thing happened on Superman 3 back in the early 80s. They did a terrible job because the guy thought, well, no one can take superheroes seriously. And thus they lost their audience. But Chaosium was so smarter than Hollywood. They said, yeah, we don't respect Lovecraft. Sandy does. So they gave me the project. Also, I never missed a deadline. That probably didn't help. Didn't hurt. Oh,
right.
But then but the kind of funny thing is, they knew they had to find something to like about Lovecraft in order to support the game and do all the stuff. So what they decided was to set it in the 1920s, because the 1920s are cool, right? So we'll set it then, and that's when he wrote the stories. So they were all obsessed with the 1920s, which I never was. I mean, I didn't mind setting it in the 20s if that's what they wanted. But to me, Lovecraft was not writing quaint stories in the 20s. He was trying to write cutting edge science. He had aircraft exploration of the Antarctic. He had ultraviolet rays. He had the discovery of Pluto. He had submarines. He had all the most advanced science of his time. And if he'd written today, he absolutely would have done that same thing. So,
Right.
That's
a good point.
Yeah. So the 20s thing never resonated. But I didn't mind. I'd run it in the 20s because really, 20s, they have phones, they have guns, they have cars, they have everything I care about that modern people have. So it didn't really bother me. Although since writing that, now we have cell phones, which is like an advance, the first big change from the 20s. Because having cell phones, you have to figure some way of dealing with it. And of course, I have ways of dealing with it that make it a liability instead of a blessing.
I'm curious, outside of Lovecraft himself, what were your inspirations for the game loop of Call of Cthulhu, or even like the scenarios of Call of Cthulhu?
My original idea was that it wouldn't just be Lovecraft. It would be a horror game, themed with Lovecraft. It actually became more Lovecraft than I expected it to be as time went on. In fact, the very first adventure I wrote for it, the haunted house. I don't know if you ever played that one.
Yes, I have actually.
Yeah, everyone has, right? You'll notice it's not Lovecraftian like at all. There's this modified guy in the basement who's doing magic spells. That was actually a scenario I made for my American Gothic game, which wasn't Lovecraft, though it had Lovecraft monsters. And so I just carried over that scenario and used it and put it in. And part of the reason I had that be the very first scenario was because it wasn't Lovecraft. See, to show players that you could have a good creepy scenario without Lovecraft. You can have a werewolf, you can have a ghost, you can have whatever. It can be any kind of horror. Lovecraft horror is especially creepy, and there's reasons that it's good, but it doesn't have to be just Lovecraft.
Yeah, speaking of doesn't have to be just Lovecraft. I remember being exposed in the early 90s, I want to say, maybe mid 90s. That was the era of gaming I kind of got into. I'm a 82 kid, so
okay. That's about time for you, yeah.
Right. My GM at the time, Chris Croston, he ran for us. He'd never tell us what he was running. He'd just kind of bring us to the table, and then
that is the best way to run Call of Cthulhu.
Yeah.
Don't tell him what it is.
He had Blood Brothers. He showed us after the fact, and those bad B skits that kind of opened my eyes to, this game that's designed for horror can also do a bad B movie trope, like horror trope, and
you can be gangsters,
right?
You gotta have murder mysteries. You can, because the system. You take out Cthulhu monsters and the sanity, and you're left with a modern age system for gaming that can do anything. But I will say, that said, the Cthulhu mythos gives a driving central pillar to hang your hat on for a campaign. You have a wide variety of terrifying monsters, and a reason to fight them besides getting wealthy. That was something that Call of Cthulhu gave us that D&D really didn't have, which is that D&D, like, you're doing things to get better, but there's no ultimate goal necessarily. But in Call of Cthulhu, it's like, we have to save the world because that's where we keep all our stuff, And in fact, you don't even want the treasures you get in Call of Cthulhu usually. Yeah. Look, you got a magic severed hand that glows. You can have that, Brad. I don't want it.
First time you play, you want it. Next time you play,
this is I'm not doesn't that. Yeah, your big treasure is a moldy old book that sends you to the madhouse by looking at the pictures, right? It's that's part of the fun of it, is you're actually doing things for the goodness of doing it. And your character, there are rules for getting a little better over time, but you tend to get worse over time more than you get better. So it's the whole game is contrarian. Okay, I didn't even know the word contrarian. I built it, but I knew it couldn't be like D&D, and I knew it couldn't be about combat because the weakest monster in the game is a cultist, and he's just as good as you and better organized. So I had to replace it. So I replaced it, with research and mysteries and investigation. But the bottom line is that if you want that, the idea in D&D and RuneQuest and every other role-playing game is you go out, you defeat the bad guy, you get better. You defeat another bad guy, get better. Defeat a bigger bad guy, get better. And that's the cycle. It is a very compelling cycle, and it's cool. But Call of Cthulhu, uniquely doesn't have that cycle. That's not what happens in Call of Cthulhu. It's a completely different look at the world. So if you want to do the regular cycle of fight, get better, you can play literally any role-playing game out there. But if you want something different, there's only Call of Cthulhu. Even games like Chill and Stalking the Knife, the competitors to the Call of Cthulhu, they did that same cycle because they were trying to fix what they thought was wrong with Call of Cthulhu, but they did it by going back to what everything else did. So
Oh yeah, that's a good point actually. Yeah, that's a really good
like
point.
I mean, sure you can play Chill, but why? But you could also just play D&D, and get the same cycle
With horror elements, yeah, exactly. Uh, what was your transition like into? So how did you get into the video game industry? I believe it was Doom that you were first.
Chaosium was not the world's greatest business then. And one possible reason for this is that they made um, their business meetings were always back in the warehouse smoking a big old hooter and passing it around and making this, and they would always pass it to me. I didn't partake. I would just pass it off. I probably got plenty of secondhand smoke, but at least I wasn't directly inhaling it. Um, and so we were always like on the verge of not bankruptcy, but it was tight. And so I had 4 kids. It was 1988, and I said, I can't keep going like this. I live in this apartment with 4 kids and it's a nightmare and I need more money. And so I told Greg that I was going to be looking for a job at Gen Con that year. And um, Lawrence Schick, who used to work at TSR, whom I knew from various conventions, came by basically trying to hire me to go work at Microprose, and he succeeded. So I moved from California to Maryland, got a job where I could actually afford a house. It was only a row house, but that was a big step up. And from then on, it was off to the races. I was doing video games, and I did those clear up until 2009, when Don Matrick killed Ensemble Studios for his own evil purposes. I always thought that was not good for Microsoft shareholders because our company had never sold less than 3 million copies of any game. But and from there, I went to actually taught school for a couple of years. You could have taken a class in video game design for me for those 2 years. And then I decided to go back into board games. And I like that. It's a lot less stressful than doing computer games. And the money at times can be as good or better because I don't have to share it with 70 other guys in my office and the giant company up in Redmond, Washington that gets their share. And I can do the game a lot faster. It's not, 70,000 man hours. It's me and a couple of guys. So I really enjoy it. That's where I did call it. And I'm actually going back into role playing now. We're going to be doing Call of Cthulhu adventures with Chaosium as a blessing, you understand? And I'm even working on a role-playing game of my own.
Very good. Very good.
A science fiction one.
There was so I know Chaosium got into the hard times during the 90s because I'm aware of that through the Pendragon move over to Peter Corliss and
Pendragon, and Greg Stafford realized that RuneQuest was kind of off on someone else. Pendragon was off on someone else. Why am I still in this company? All they really had left was Call of Cthulhu. And then they did the Mythos card game, which was really successful. And that's what killed them, because they had an argument over whether they should keep pushing Mythos. And Greg said, let's get our money and get out, and they said, no, it'll go on forever. It'll be a CCG. And of course they were wrong anyway. But the other problem was that the guy in charge of ordering this is a classic Chaosium move. The guy in charge of ordering the second expansion for Mythos, the card game. Okay. He had taken to smoking a joint in the morning as well as the afternoon. Okay. And he called Lampa, the printer, and he ordered 20,000 copies of the expansion, and what they needed was 2,000. And he never checked until they arrived at the doorstep, and there was 20,000 copies. I could be wrong with the numbers, but I remember it was times as big, and that almost bankrupted them. And then they kicked Greg out, and incidentally, before Greg died, a few years before, he called me up and said, "Hey, guess what, Sandy? I don't smoke dope anymore." I said, "That's great, Greg. It's so okay if someone else does," he says, "but I feel clearer. My head's better. I can write better." And he actually said, "I'm high on life." And I said, "Greg, if I told that to you in the 80s, you would have laughed me to scorn." And he said, "Well, that's true." But So he did. He had changed his ways. He wasn't the guy to blame for that order, though.
For sure. I know I came into Pendragon late, so I owned third edition actually in the 90s, and I didn't touch it. Like I opened it, I was highly intimidated by the idea of running Arthurian lore. I felt like even though I'd read a bit of the classics, I still felt intimidated like trying to take that step. And then way later on to 2020 I got into it, and I'm sad that I got into it after Greg's passing because it's become one of my
It's a really interesting
staples.
system, you know.
Right. Yeah.
It's you know, thanks partly to Greg's influence, my system of design has always been do the theme in the background first. I get steeped in themes. Even when I do a board game, I start like a lot of guys doing a board game. They will begin by making a system, then fit in different factions and stuff. But I do the factions first. So when you play Cthulhu Wars, my feeling is it feels like you're in the Lovecraft apocalypse. If you play Pendragon, you feel like you're an Arthurian character. Ending up for the cause of justice against those evil Saxons. And
Absolutely. What was the
feature that every game is a year, in Pendragon? So you do one adventure a year or every 2 years, and you have kids and they grow up, and that's kind of fun.
I've been building my channel off of kind of running games and actual play through the Great Pendragon campaign. So my goal is it's ambitious to try and record that and get all the way through, but that's my goal. Almost the end of Anarchy at this point. So I was curious, what did it feel like after all that time to have that resurgence of Chaosium in the late 2010s, where they brought you and you and Greg were back,
Well, what happened is that so Chaosium was 1/3 was owned by Lynn Willis, 1/3 by Charlie Crank, 1/3 by Greg Stafford, and I had a few tiny percentages. I don't like 3%, if that I got when I left the company because they were sad to see me go and they wanted to always have a part of it. Okay, so I leave the company, and then Lynn Willis died, and the bylaws stated that when an owner dies, his shares don't go to his heirs. Instead, the heirs, the company has to buy out the heir, and those shares are split among the current owners. So prorated. So what happened is Charlie got about half the shares, Greg got about half the shares, and I got a few more, so I was up to like 7%. Okay, and what happened is that Greg started calling me saying, "Hey, you and me, I became the kingmaker. With you on my side," says Greg, "we can take over Chaosium." Then Charlie calls me and says, "Hey, Sandy, with you on my side, we can take over Chaosium, right? We can save her from Greg." And so I was trying to mediate between them for a long time. And in the end, I decided that Charlie had bungled too many things for too long. For one thing, the entire time Charlie had been in charge at Chaosium, they had never paid my royalties a single time. So that kind of was a telling fact. So the so we ousted Charlie, and then we sold our shares to the Reaching Moon Productions, who still owns it today, and they are competent businessmen, which, as I said, Chaosium never really was. So they are making a go of it. And I just got back from the Chaosium Con number 4, I think, 4 or 5, where they hold it every year up in Ypsilanti. So yeah, they're doing good. They got new games. They have a 7 Seas game. They're
yeah. And what was your branch into Petersen Games? Was that what the focus on the board game piece to begin with, or what was your vision?
The purpose of Petersen Games was to provide a corporate shell. That sounds like a real rich thing to do. My tiny little corporation of 2 guys, right? But that was the shell that I would do Cthulhu Wars and my other board games with. So we did Cthulhu Wars, we did Planet Apocalypse, we did a bunch of other games. We probably got 20 games under our belt, under that thing. And so that was simply my new company.
Okay.
Because even though I still basically Chaosium bought me out of RuneQuest. They put me down to one. They bought me down to 1%, and so I sold on 1%. They wanted me to keep 1%, and they bought out my royalties on Call of Cthulhu, and I agreed to that. What they gave me was worth what I gave up. I felt, so that's fine.
I am curious, Sandy. I always do this with guests towards the end. I'm curious if there's anything you wanted to either shout out or anything you're working on right now that you're excited about that you wanted to talk
Oh
about.
yeah,
Yeah.
I have a Patreon. Why don't I mention that? So it's Sandy of Cthulhu, one word. And what I do on it is you get you get an essay on Lovecraft or gaming once a week. You get a piece of a game or a advanced view of a game or game rules for something for a cool add-on for D&D or Call of Cthulhu, or usually when I do D&D it's also Call of Cthulhu, or for Cthulhu Wars or anything like that, about once a month. And then if you're the highest level, which then you also get a downloadable STL to print out a cool figure of a giant monster or Cthulhu or something like that. So that's my Patreon, and check it out.
And as far as the board games, you've done things like I just want to do a minor shout out to these Cthulhu Wars.
Cthulhu Wars is my flagship product. In this, you're fighting over Cthulhu has risen, mankind has fallen, and all these other entities have come up from the sea, down from the sky, out of the earth, to fight over the ruins of Earth. So you play one of these factions. You are Cthulhu, or you are Hastur, or you are the crawling chaos, and you're battling over it. And the appeal of it is that the factions feel really different. Like a strategy that works for the black goat won't work for Cthulhu. So we change to a different faction, it's like a whole new game. So that's the thing. And I also have a game which is pretty much equally popular, called Planet Apocalypse, which is a cooperative game where you and your teammates are it's the last days. Hell has risen to destroy the world. So it's kind of like Doom. It's basically soldiers versus demons, and you're leading your guys out to fight them. But it's part combat, but it's also tower defense, because you're laying down ambushes of troops to shoot at the demons as they come by. And so I don't know if there's not a lot of tower defense board games out there, so it's unique in there. And it's not all tower defense; you also have to fight. And I've been told that it is one of the very toughest single or cooperative games out there.
Well, that's nice.
My own figure, the co-op games should be tough, because if you get it the first time you play, why would you play it again? But in my group can now beat the easiest levels almost every time, first try. But the top levels with the top monsters, it's mathematically possible to win, but it's not simple.
My experience with a lot of co-op games is it gets you the first time or two where it's real close because you don't know the loop yet of the game and you aren't coordinating well. But the moment you coordinate well, those, they aren't typically difficult, and they almost lose their appeal at that point. If you knew they would
find the Planet Apocalypse would keep some of that appeal because of the way it's shaping things up.
Yeah, that's
interesting. And different different demons. Like one of the ways it happens is that every so often, basically, you have this track with demons, lesser demons running along towards you, and you're trying to kill them, because if they get to the end of the line and leave, then you lose Doom. So you're killing them as they go along. And also, there's the demon lord who moves much more slowly, and if he gets to the end, you just lose. But also, every few turns, he spawns what's called a fourth circle demon. They're like a mini boss. And when they come on, they change the whole map in some way that's bad for you. So you're really focused on either killing or avoiding these guys. Plus, in addition to killing little demons, you have to kill the big demon eventually. That's how you win the game. And you have to figure out how to get to him and kill him. And, and you can't, usually it takes more than one strike. It's not just one boss battle where you win. You have to go in there multiple times and knock him down a little bit, then retreat and kind of lick your wounds, try it again. Meanwhile, as the game goes on, you get a real feeling of impending doom, because the game ramps up and gets tougher as you play. Every time the track goes around, you add more doom dice to get monsters with, and it just becomes more or despair dice. It becomes a tougher game until almost every game I play, the players, when they win, they feel like one more turn they would have lost. They barely won. And I think that's a good way to feel about the game. You never feel it was a trivial act. It's like, we made it by the span of our teeth.
That's my goal for any tabletop role-playing game as a GM as well.
Yeah, yes. Role-playing games are that way too. You feel like it. But a role-playing game is easier to rate because the game master, like, they're going to beat this boss too easy. Well, now he has 2 red dragons along with him, to show how terrible he is. And he can balance it a little bit, or if they're right. But in the game where I'm not there to do that, no game master, then I have to plan ahead, right? And so one of the things I do when I go to conventions, people that have Pen the Apocalypse, sometimes they'll say, well, usually they know how to win it on their own, but a few of them are like, I played this 8 times, I can't win, show me how. So I will go and help them run the game and show them some ideas, and then they go, oh, I get it. We have to cooperate, but also be smart.
I'm conscious of your time here, Sandy. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for the talk.
Okay.
This was very interesting.
Any final questions before I go?
No, I think that covers just about everything.
Great.
Yeah.